Chapter 21 Chronicle of the Vortex, as experienced by Clayton Marcells. December 6th, 2049. When I opened my eyes, I was still seated within the campsite just as I had been before. But Dylan, Rodney, Bill, and the ghosts were absent. I looked to my side and I saw a faded, transparent Harris begin to solidify in the chair. I watched as he awakened and looked around in surprise. "Are we in?" he said, looking at his hands and flexing them as if to confirm their corporeal presence. I studied our surroundings and realized that it seemed once more as if I were bathed in the light of an indigo sun. The world appeared bright in the dark-hued radiance, as if it was noonday, and all was still silent and motionless. "I believe that we are," I stated, as I stood and looked to the source of the light, and found it originating at the lake below us. "But where are all the ghosts?" he said, as he looked out into the woods, disoriented and with a curious, puzzled expression. "I think that they are here, but we are within our own sphere of perception. Just as the ghosts aren't always aware of each other, we are not completely aware of them." "Oh, so what do we do now?" "We go to the lake," I said, as I began to walk down the path. Harris was smiling as he followed and chuckled to himself as he jogged to catch up. "There are no bugs," he chimed happily. "Yes, but there can be a lot worse things here. Believe me." As he came to the shore of the lake, we were momentarily awestruck with the sight of what met us there. Over the calm purple water, there was a tall cyclone of whirling violet energy, which resembled a smaller version of the one I had seen in Mossborough during my earlier experience. "That's it, isn't it?" Harris said with wonder. "That's what a vortex looks like." "That's nothing compared to what these things look like when they're fully activated. What we are seeing was just a remnant, an afterthought to the magnificent rift in time and space which had been opened some 20 years ago." "So what do we do now?" "We walk to it," I said, as I stepped onto the water as if it were a floor of rippling, moving glass. Harris followed without question, and soon we could feel the magnetic pull of the anomaly as it began to draw us in. I looked up into the sky and I saw a large number of ravens flying in circles around and into the folds of the vortex. Harris saw them as well and looked at me questioningly. "I think that's a good sign. If they're here, then they might be watching over us. Once we're inside, we need to concentrate on Dee and Shaden and hope that somehow we will be guided to them." Halfway across the lake, I began to feel myself lifted up like a leaf blown on a strong wind, and soon we were carried effortlessly towards the moving wall of the anomaly's edge. There, within the roaring sound reminiscent of some enormous storm, I heard laughter at my side, and I knew that it was Harris with me. Sounds, shapes, motion, and image converged in a vast moving spectrum of perception and mixing senses. The feeling of being deconstructed, rebuilt, and once more pulled apart was both sensually brilliant and at the same time terrifying. What was left after all physical manifestation was obliterated was the complete absence of bodily habitation and a new overwhelming influx of the mind's singular reasoning. I was reduced to a thought within a dream, and all desire was a flickering memory of some half-forgotten theory of flesh. But throughout all of this, I was searching, looking, and listening with some primordial searchlight for two recognizable stars in a cosmos of infinite sparkling entities. Just as I felt I was lost in this ongoing eternal helix, I saw the black form of a raven flying ahead, and I knew that here was my guide. Take me to them, I thought, and I watched as it dove down into the heart of a dark, pulsing orb of tranquil violet energy. However, as the light receded, and we once more stood within a dark, material plane, I realized all was not well. Once more, I was in a bodiless state of observation, with Harris's presence only an impression in my consciousness. Funny, I don't remember anyone mentioning that the ghost world was a utilitarian death zone. His voice echoed in my mind as if it were a thought of my own. That's because it wasn't the last time I was here. It seemed we were soaring over a vast, never-ending labyrinth of concrete and steel at a speed like that of a jet flying low over the earth below. This was but one city that stretched as far as we could see in every direction, and its appearance was a duplicate of the architecture I had seen at all of the Yamashita complexes. It was as if the corporate bases had grown like a fungus, spreading out over the world until it had swallowed them. No matter how far we went and how closely we searched, there was no sign of life anywhere, to be found in the red, hellish glow of the falling sun sinking into the polluted abyss. How far could this go on? Harris questioned. I mean, we've just covered an area of 900 miles, I'm sure, and we haven't even seen a tree, let alone a person. I looked ahead and still saw the Raven flying before us through the black clouds of foul smoke which issued from thousands of industrial smokestacks. Where are we? Is this the United States? He asked, as our altitude dropped until we could see the barren, empty streets below. Judging by the outline of the coast we flew over, I'm guessing our location to be somewhere off of the Gulf Coast in Mississippi. This was all wrong. There's no possible way that all this came about just in the time since I last saw it. Clayton, I think they succeeded. Harris's voice said with despair. What? But how? Even as I spoke, I felt another presence in my mind, pushing at the door of my consciousness, tapping and scratching with claws and beak. The Raven wanted in. Do you feel that? Harris said with a certain excitement. I do, I replied as the pressure increased and my will to resist seemed failing and futile. Let us see what it wants. I don't think we have a choice, I answered, as whatever barrier my mind held against the entity crashed into debris and I was bombarded with the massive tsunamis of rushing information. The year had been 1943, and the inventor genius, Dragislav Aslita, had been found dead in his New York apartment. The coroner's report had given the reason for his demise as natural causes. Even though Drago had been hard at work, he had shown no presentable results to his investors, and as a result, had died buried in debt. When his debtors had fallen upon his apartment and laboratory, they found that someone had already beaten them to the punch. Someone had stolen every piece of equipment and recorded data the elderly scientist had used for the past decade. The event remained one of the greatest mysteries in the world of historical science. Those close to Dragislav had conjectured that, due to his apparently deteriorating mental state, that perhaps he had destroyed the materials himself. It was widely spoken of in the scientific community and media that the inventor had slowly been succumbing to mental illness for decades, and that his experiments had been, at their best, questionable in value. At the same time, Europe had become a hotbed of political upheaval as the Socialist Workers' Union had managed to unite all its subsidiaries into a single, frighteningly powerful organization whose leaders remained hidden and unknown to the world at large. What followed was a string of fixed elections and whispered of bribery, which would place the Union as the single most powerful world organization in history. There would be little or no resistance to the advent of the Union's control, as seemingly it would usher in a new era of jobs and prosperity amongst the lower classes. Economy boomed as industry grew, and the business of expansion became the primary objective of the Union in the world market. Technologies undreamt of emerged overnight as a new campaign of anti-ghost sentiment was introduced silently among the masses like a slow poison. Another aspect which spread through the New World like quicksilver was a powerful adherence to the policy of eugenics. The concept of breeding a purified human race took hold like never before as Union labs developed a standard system of genetic qualification to which all humans would be judged. Eugenics, like all things, had become an industry in its own right. The breeding of better, more physically perfected humans, along with the disposal of less desirable specimens, became common law as institutions designed to carry out both sprawled across the world landscape. Everywhere one looked in the engorged monolithic cities were screens depicting a constant and unrelenting propaganda to promote the beliefs and code of the Union. People were told that they deserved to have the right to be free of the shackles of corrupt genetic influence. No longer would they watch as inferior specimens of the human condition slowed the machinations of progress and prosperity. The old, the sick, and weak would finally be disposed of so that the young, strong, and capable could push the system ever forward to utopia. Meanwhile, work had become life, and the general state of human existence was one of ongoing, never-ending labor in the name of the Union. Children were bred, conditioned, and evaluated to find their appropriate niche in the gears of the world machine. The one problem left facing the ever-expanding juggernaut of industry was the presence of the wretched and sorrowful spirits of the dead. However, this problem would soon be remedied with the appearance of several vortexes and the introduction of a new technology called ghostlight in the second decade of the 2000th century. The vortexes became the center spokes in the turning wheels of the Union's world empire. The ads would run declaring, "We are the living, and we shall be free of the dead." The human animal was now a drug-fueled race of worker ants, so fearful of forced withdrawal from the various government-supplied pharmaceuticals that to be rid of the nagging, doubtful presence of the miserable deceased seemed like a blessing like none other. So popular was this new technology that the Socialist Union renamed itself under a label more fitting of its status as the One World Corporation. Vortex. The detractors of the Vortex Corporation were few and far between, but still there remained hidden pockets of resistance, which were branded cults by the Vortex propaganda engine. These cells of rebel insurrection were hunted like vermin by the massive Vortex security committees, and the punishment for such behavior was far worse than death. The rebel organization calling itself Raven Eye worked as a terrorist group bent on the unmasking of Vortex executives and the destruction of the main corporate bases. Bombings, assassinations, and espionage were their trademarks as their guerrilla war was suppressed and almost extinguished time and time again. The Raven Eye was led by a mysterious figure known only as the Bacchus. For the past few years, graffiti containing message like "The Bacchus comes and the vortex will close" was found spray-painted everywhere, from the sides of corporate buildings to the walls of disposal factories. Intrusive computer viruses would shut down entire cities for weeks, which would begin when monitors would flash, "Down with the vortex, long live the Bacchus." Captured members of the rebel factions were tortured and interrogated for months, but would only speak of the fall of the Vortex Corporation at the hands of the Bacchus, an individual who they would only describe as one who was reputedly like the Roman god. If history has been remade here, then wouldn't it affect events in our homeworld? I asked of the disembodied presence I knew to be Harris. Exactly, came a reply of transferred thought. That is why I do not believe that this is actually the ghost world. Then what is it? My guess would be a tangent alternate reality created from the point of interference. Another reality? Yes, and I would venture to reason that it is serving to destabilize the fragile balance of the other two as well. As we flew onward, I saw that the Raven was now flying headlong into a swirling violet orb, which had appeared ahead of us in the dark gray sky, reminiscent of the wormhole created by Angelica in St. Louis. As we were swallowed by the intense burst of light, I felt as if I were once more being plunged into the bottomless depths of a vast ocean of energy. When we emerged, we perceived a much more familiar version of the same area we had just experienced. We had arrived directly over Savannah, Georgia. The Raven, once more, was pushing into our minds, and I watched as the landscape below vanished as we melted into another world. The club was a bustling, confused melting pot of ages and ethnicities dressed in standard steampunk attire. People gathered around the stage as the tables were filled with groups seating themselves near the stage and ordering drinks from busy, dashing waitresses and waiters. A hush fell over the crowd as the lights were dimmed and a purple glow began to emanate from the stage. 5 shadows stepped through the light and took positions by their instruments. As the light increased, I recognized the tall, thin young man in brass goggles holding a guitar beside a short, blonde woman at the microphone, also shod in large eyewear. In the back, a wiry-built young man with the stubble of brown hair and beard, with massive mirror sunglasses set at the drums, while a giant bear-like young man with a beard to his chest slung a bass guitar over his shoulder. The small figure of a tiny Asian woman was moving amongst a virtual wall of computer monitors and keyboards, her large glasses reflecting the occasional light from one of the many devices. "Ladies and gentlemen," said a male voice over the PA system, "the steam engine proudly presents Raven Eye." A low hum of a synthesizer organ began like the opening of a church service as a spectacular array of dazzling lights and lasers began to shine over the club. There was a fierce but short applause as the audience fell, entranced and silent by Shaitan's clear feline voice, rasping the first verse of the song, Enrapture. Through the haze of winding dreams into an ocean deep, I follow you over the darkest woods beyond the wall of sleep. What perils waits of my journey's end, a secret you will keep. I follow you the rustling wings of night's own cruel deceit. The music was low and gradually building into a startling arrangement of electronica mixed with a solid blues-sounding core. The effect was mesmerizing and spell-like to the crowd as she continued. Your path will lead me far from here and far from the world I know, over forest filled with nightmarish deeds and sorrow's lonely ghost. The essence of your love a star and a hope I cannot capture. But in this flight I feel I'm whole, and I fall to grace enraptured. At this last line, the music broke into a magnificent wave of thundering drums and bass, with the single piercing cry of a guitar lead solo echoing through the club like the voice of some mystic animal. The crowd was lost within the sights and sound of the show, as if it were some spiritual revelation, as Shaden went into the chorus with Nico singing in the background. And though falling and falling, these wings will soon take flight. Falling and falling, you make this darkness bright. As the song ended, the audience erupted in a massive applause and shouts. The lights dimmed and the band left the stage. They walked down the steps and into the back to a large dressing room where they seated themselves on the couches and were given bottled water by the waitress. Outside, the announcer's voice was once more appeared, saying, "Remember, folks, to stop at the booths outside for your Raven Night t-shirts and travel mugs. The band's new album can be downloaded at Casimir.com or purchased here at the Discounter." It had been only 3 months since Nico's rescue from the Distortionists at her home in Mossborough. Dee and Shaden had taken her to their house in Savannah and into their world. She had learned that they and 2 men named Doug Peterson and Reginald Stone were members of a little-known underground musical group called Raven Eye that frequented the clubs in the southern steampunk circuit. She also learned that the 4 claimed to be reincarnated refugees from a devastated alternate reality they referred to as the Lost Earth. It was here that Nico concluded that there may have been several entities as well as the Raven. Their memories of the world were as foggy and irresolute as old movies dug from the back of a closet. They described a man called the Sorcerer, who had brought about the destruction via some ritual which had infected the population with a horrible supernatural plague. This man they described as a descendant from a long and cursed line that had taken to the worship of an entity resembling a serpent. Dee and Shaden had been members of a group of psychics who had been attempting to enlighten and improve the world at large, only to witness its complete destruction. After a long period obscured and broken in the minds of the 4, the Sorcerer was bound in a chamber within the house of his family, and the house submerged beneath the waters of a lake. It was during this time that they died, their first remembered deaths before reincarnating again within the ruin of the Lost Earth. It was here that they had become the true servants of the Raven and united to try and rebuild humanity in the shadow of the Serpent's apocalypse. This hope of reconstruction had lasted only until the next conflict amongst the survivors themselves. It was indicated to Nico that even though Dee and Shaden had memories of this time, they were hesitant to relive them, although they did suggest that their second remembered deaths had been particularly hard and traumatic. Shaden and Dee had not lied about the story of their meeting. Both of them had grown into adolescence with a fascination for the vortex and had traveled to Mississippi in order to view and revel in the surroundings of their passion. They had repeatedly met each other at the lake while both investigating the scene and had naturally begun talking to one another. This initial spark of friendship had ignited a romance like neither of the two had ever experienced, as they both underwent an awakening together. They had only met Doug and Reggie, seemingly by chance, during the particularly long and painful duration of Shaden's awakening. It was explained to Nico that as a person is awakened to their own psychic powers, usually through contact with a powerful entity such as the Raven, they undergo a time of physical sickness and mental turmoil. In their original world, where such abilities could be very powerful and life-changing, this spirit sickness would often occur at a very young age. But here, the onset had come only after their first psychic contact with the Ravens of the Vortex. Dee had passed through his illness in days, with no greater symptoms than that of a common flu, but Shaden had fallen into an illness so intense and mentally arduous that Dee had taken her to a hospital in Atlanta. She was admitted to the ER with a temperature cresting 104 and suffering from vivid, feverish hallucinations. It was there that she first came into contact with Doug and Reggie, who were both her attending nurses on 2 different shifts, but living under the given names of their current lives. She saw Doug, Tom, on days, and Reggie, Bernie, on second shift. As it turned out, both were avid Vortex enthusiasts and part-time blues musicians. As Shaden recovered, she found herself involved in several conversations regarding the Vortex with both. On the day of her release, she had been dressing and talking to Doug through the bathroom door. "You know, there's a guy on evenings you should meet, Tom. He's a Vortex nut, too." "Bernie, right? Talks about his stupid dog all the time," he had answered as he perused her chart. "Yeah. You know him?" she said as she adjusted her bra. "Know him? Honey, he's my boyfriend." She had come out and winced at the bright light of morning sunlight flooding the room. Her eyes had been extremely photosensitive since her illness, and she still had not adjusted to the tricks they played on her. She had looked up at the huge, smiling giant in blue scrubs. "Good job. He's cute," she said, giving him a playful nudge with her elbow as she passed. "He's a real piece of work, all right," he replied. "My boyfriend plays guitar. Maybe we should get together and jam sometime." The words had left her mouth before she had even formed them as a coherent thought. "The tall vampire-looking guy in the hallway," he said with a raised eyebrow. "That would be him. You'll like him. He's kind of hard to understand sometimes, but you'll get used to that." "Moody artist type?" "No, he's German, like literally hard to understand." Tom had laughed and agreed to meet them for drinks at a club that Friday night. To say that they had hit it off would have been an understatement. The night had turned into an intense 5-hour-long, in-depth discussion of the vortex, the incorporeal dead, and ghostlight. The next day they had met Tom and Bernie's house to play music in their garage. By this time, Dee and Shaden were wearing large sunglasses to disguise the disquieting changes occurring to their ocular orbs. By the third jam session and a month later, both Tom and Bernie were mentioning strange dreams and the presence of an absurd number of ravens flocking around their home. As the two gradually became more aware and physically activated, Dee and Shaden introduced them to some of the oddities they had uncovered. Within a month, they too would remember lives long past beyond the horizon of the vortex. When Nico arrived at the Savannah house, she had almost immediately fallen ill with what Dee and Shaden guessed was the spirit sickness. She had lain feverish and aching as her stomach retched and cramped with seemingly endless volley of torments. Doug and Reggie had examined her as a large gray schnauzer studied her closely from the door by the couch. She had asked for something to kill the pain and bring the fever down. "I'm very sorry, Nico," Reggie had said, as he placed a cold ice pack on her scorching forehead. "Any kind of drug will interfere with the process and only prolong it. Even after this passes, you'll find any foreign substance to be detrimental to whatever abilities or awareness you gain. Anything beyond an occasional drink can completely sublimate your connection to the energy. You can still smoke a little marijuana if you are so inclined, but I really wouldn't recommend it," Doug had said sympathetically. They had lifted her gently from the couch and taken her to a bedroom off the side of the stairs. Here she was placed in a warm bed, and the 4 residents of the old house took turns sitting with her over the course of the next 5 days. To distract her during the intense and unrelentingly nightmarish hallucinations, they read to her, each from a different book. Shaden read her Wuthering Heights, which she professed to be the greatest romance ever written. Dee read from Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire, which he called one of the greatest stories ever put to paper. Reggie read a strange novel called Night Watch by a Russian writer named Sergei Lukyanenko, and Doug read her Twilight by Stephanie Meyer, which he called the greatest romance ever written. During the apex of her illness, when the hallucinations had become a solid wall of horrors between her and the physical reality around her, Dee had taken her hand. "All is well, mankind, and all of this will pass. You are remembering your past self, and the conflict between that life and this is tearing at your soul. You must remember that you are safe, and that the raven will guide you through this storm." His words were like cold water poured on the burning fire within her. His voice was low, distant, and calming, as finally she transgressed the battlefield of her mind and began to find darkness and sleep. Before she slipped into unconsciousness, she opened her eyes and looked at the pale, thin face and large, shining goggles. "The snakes, Dee. The snakes are everywhere. And the house. I do not want to go into the house again." He had smiled sadly and touched her cheek with his long fingers. "Forget these things for now and sleep." The words fell like stones, bouncing down the walls of a deep well and landing in the bottom, sending ripples through the waters of her psyche. She would not talk of the glimpse she had received into her previous existence, and the others did not question her. She had spent the better part of her recovery sitting quietly, gazing out the window into the garden outside. The days were overcast and slightly chill, but still the ravens gathered in the trees outside and watched her convalesce. Her eyes had begun to change, as the others had warned they would, but there were no ghosts for her to see. She had wept for hours one night as she considered the truth, that she could be considered almost solely responsible for the emptiness she now felt around her in the spiritual plane. The others had refused to let her slip into depression and self-pity. They had cajoled her from her room daily to sit in the parlor as they played cards or music by candlelight, as their eyes were somewhat sensitive to bright electrical light. She had taken piano lessons for a year as a child, but had lost interest during adolescence. Now, she felt an awakening fascination with the sound of music, and had taken to downloading Mozart and Beethoven into her portable player, which she carried around with her constantly. She had sat down one day by the fire with a glass of wine and put Mozart's unfinished Requiem on a loop. And before she had known it, the sun was rising through the curtains of the window and the battery was dead on her player. The others had explained that this was a byproduct of her new connection with the entity. She had taken to once more fiddling with the keys of the grand piano they kept in the music room, and within a few days was playing with a skill she had never possessed before. She was now playing pieces by ear after only hearing them 2 or 3 times, and by the end of her second week at the Savannah House, she was accompanying the others during their sessions. "It is good," Dee had said one afternoon after a particularly brilliant improvisation. "It seems we have found our keyboard player at last." The thought of being on a stage and playing music had seemed absurd but thrilling. However, she would soon find that there would be many things she would have once considered absurd in which she would now be taking part. The group had on at least 2 occasions left her alone in the house to attend to what they would only refer to as business. She would soon learn that the group was actively involved in the detection of distortion cult hideouts, which were predominantly at old abandoned hospital sites. Halfway into her 3rd week in Savannah, she was told that their intent was not just to find the hideouts, but to eradicate them as well. She had then been taken into a secret room in the cellar of the house where the computer lab was located and shown a relative stockpile of weapons and ammunition. "You don't actually expect me to use a gun and shoot people," she had said with utter disbelief. "It's a package deal, sweetie," Shaden answered as she ran her hands over a semi-automatic assault rifle. "Someone's got to put a stop to them playing around with the vortex. The Ravens had enough of them hijacking its power so that they can diddle with nature like it's a goddamn game. Can you feel it? Can't you sense the disruption in the air around you? They are tearing the universe apart, and Yamashita is just a pawn now." Shaden was right. She could feel it. Every waking moment was filled with the anxious, heightening sense that something was going very wrong in the universe. It was like walking through a dream that you've had a dozen times, and you know that the next part is going to spiral down into the depths of a horrible nightmare if you don't take control and change it. 20 years previous, an extremely liberal administration had passed legislation which would fundamentally socialize healthcare in the United States. Millions of dollars had been poured into the construction of hospitals all across the country in order to ensure provisional health care for almost every member of the population. This had come as a backlash to a long period in American history of corporate-provided medicine, which had left insurance rates raised to the point of being unaffordable to all but the wealthiest of citizens. Many businesses had found themselves incapable of insuring their employees, and a healthcare crisis had ensued. After the pendulum had swung far to the left, the government had found its resources exhausted, and within 15 years, over half of the newly constructed hospitals were closed in an immediate set of emergency cutbacks. Unbeknownst to the general public, many of these institutions had become the headquarters for the Distortionist cults, who had found the abandoned buildings still storing much of the medical equipment they so craved for their bizarre activities. Through bribery, blackmail, and threatened violence, they had kept their presence in the closed clinics relatively secret from the authorities as well. The group had located some 13 such hospitals within a 5-state grid, of which 5 were definite Distortionist headquarters. Their surveillance had revealed that the cults were acquiring electronic equipment and storing them for illicit purposes. A raid had been planned by the Savannah Group on one such hospital in South Carolina, and Nico was asked to take part. Reluctantly, she had agreed. She was taken to a gun range by Dee and Shaden, where she was given a refresher course in firearms. Being the daughter of a Yakuza boss, Nico was well acquainted with martial arts and armed combat. After mentioning to Doug and Reggie that she had trained in kendo as a teenager, she was presented with a very expensive katana ordered online from a swordsmith in Florida. She was alive with exhilaration as she now found herself, after years locked away in a research facility, training her new friends in various forms of Japanese fighting styles. For the first time in her recent memory, she wished her father was present so that he might be proud that she was at long last becoming the person he had hoped she would be, a strong individual immersing herself in the traditions of her family. She wondered how she could have ever drifted so far afield of the things which truly made her feel complete and real. The group had parked in the double garage, a large black van that they used to haul equipment to gigs during their brief local tours. It was in the dark hours of morning that they loaded the van with a very different variety of items, including guns, ammo, laptops, and camping gear. Their trip would take them to Interstate 85, headed to Greenville before turning off into the lower Appalachians towards their destination. Many of the hospitals in question had been constructed as clinics for the lower class in rural areas, and the Mercy Care Hospital in Queensland was a prime example. They stopped for breakfast at a roadside diner, and afterwards all seemed to be enjoying the trip despite their somber objective. It was nearing noon as they arrived in Queensland, a small town of some 200 residents scattered so sporadically in the heart of the Appalachian foothills that it was barely recognizable as a town at all. The road, which had once been the main travel route to the hospital, was now a broken asphalt path which ran deep into the surrounding woodland. The day was dark and foggy as a mist of rain fell occasionally over the van as they made their way down the winding road into a shallow valley. They soon turned off onto a dirt path and pulled into the deserted remains of a dilapidated farm. Doug and Reggie had been scouting the area for weeks and found the farm as the only suitable ground base for their endeavor. A cow path ran down into the valley and along the back of the far northern hills behind the hospital, providing them access on foot. The rest of the day was spent setting up their gear before the night's planned reconnaissance. They did not dare start a campfire, but warmed their dinner on propane grills in the orange glow of green canister camping lanterns. Reggie explained over their meal of canned beef stew that there was a profound lack of security around the clinic, as the Distortionists held little fear of discovery or intrusion. The cult members came and went in the late hours, and had set up satellite dishes which they used to maintain contact with other bases and provide connection to the internet. They believed that their operation was powered by the hospital's emergency power generators. Nico found it difficult to accept that the state had allowed such valuable equipment to be left behind to rust in the backwoods of Appalachia. Doug explained that this was a result of the stubborn refusal of the government program to admit its own abysmal failure. Plans had been put on the books to reopen the hospitals up until only a few months previous. Doug now felt that the Distortionists would find a way to keep the clinics in their current forgotten state until their purposes had been fulfilled to the cult. As the daylight waned, they removed their goggles and sunglasses in order to see if any ghostly entities were present. All they found was the dim shade of a farmer's wife who was wandering the interior of the decaying farmhouse, apparently going about a daily routine of washing dishes which were not there and attending to a family which was not present. Nico paused only a moment to study the woman, and once again she was struck with the peculiar peace upon the woman's face. Far from a soul lost in repetitive limbo, the woman seemed to be reenacting a particularly pleasant day in her life. "Shaden," she had asked as the group made their way back to prepare for the trek into the valley. "What, honey?" Shaden answered, turning her enormous black raven eyes back to Nico. "What do we do if we do run into some of the distortionist spirits?" "Reggie and Doug will capture the black clothing." Ninjas, she thought to herself. How appropriate. The trail into the valley hadn't been used in years, and at times seemed to disintegrate into weeds and tall grass of the woods. However, soon they came to a ridge overlooking the valley where Nico got her first view of the hospital grounds. It was a small 3-story clinic building surrounded by a cracked asphalt parking lot and a tall mesh fence. Everything in sight was overgrown with long tangled vines and invading flora from the woods, as if no one had attempted upkeep in years. To all appearances, the place was abandoned unless one was to look closely at certain trees and building corners where small security cameras could be seen slowly performing a back and forth sweep. Doug and Reggie had identified all camera positions and mapped a course around them to the back of the hospital. It was through a first-floor window into what had been an administration office that they intended to make their entry. As they crept silently through the thick trees and underbrush, guided only by the moonlight, that they saw a light in the distance moving swiftly towards the front gate. Dee climbed up a ledge and peered through night vision binoculars at the disturbance. He saw a van stop at the front gate, and the familiar form of a tall woman get out and unchain the fence. Despite her large trench coat, stocking cap, and scarf-wrapped face, he instantly recognized her as the muscle-bound distortionist woman from Nico's house. It was Pandora. As he watched, the van drove in, and she unchained the gate again behind it. There was a sound at their side, which had them all reaching for their guns, and they breathed a unified sigh of relief as they saw the large black raven land on Shaden's arm. Shaden stared intently into the dimly glowing eyes of the bird before she looked back to them and whispered, "They've got people drugged in the van. They're kids, runaways from Greenville. They lured them with drugs and they got more than they bargained for. If we don't do something, they'll be dead by morning." Nico looked at the masked faces of her friends and realized that this would be no recon mission. They were going in. They snuck along the blind spot in the camera's peripheral and found their way to the generator shed behind the hospital. Within, they could hear the slow hum of the machine. Doug located the main power line into the hospital and placed a small remote device over the wire. When the time came, he would activate the device and it would clip the wire with automated blades. They moved through the shadows behind the back of the building, making sure to stay hidden in the tree growth. They approached a large office window, and Dee carefully began cutting the thick glass with a laser cutter that looked like a bladeless jigsaw. Once the 2-foot diameter piece was removed with suction cups, they began to climb in. They now stood inside a dusty, moldering office where a desk still sat complete with a plastic-covered computer and keyboard. Dee crept up the door of the office and peered into the hallway through the blinds of the window. He froze and immediately felt cold fear run over his body in a biting wave. The hallway outside was filled with over a dozen horribly deformed spirits crawling like giant insects of flesh over the walls and floor. The hospital was overrun. He slowly turned back to the group and then slumped down against the door as he contemplated their situation with nervous fear. "They're everywhere," he whispered. "The whole hospital is filled with them. We can't just sneak in like mice into the pantry." Shaden looked out and fell back, clutching her .45 Magnum to her chest. "Doug and Reggie can't freeze that many," she said in horror as she looked to the other three. It was then they heard a bizarre sound, like a faint humming, begin all around them, and as they watched, the long fluorescent lights above them began to flicker and come to life. Doug quickly pushed the remote on his chest, but it had no effect as the lights of the entire building came on. But instead of being bathed in pale electric light, they found themselves immersed in the dim indigo radiance of ghost light. As they watched in terror, they heard a sound behind the wall of the office as the handle of the locked door began to jiggle. There were shapes moving like jellyfish in a lit aquarium outside the blinds of the surrounding windows into the hall. All at once, the glass exploded, and they were swarmed in the twisted, altered forms of half a dozen semi-transparent spirits flooding the room. Shaden was grabbed and flung against the wall by a skinless torso with one clawed, preternaturally long arm. Reggie and Doug threw up their arms, and Nico watched as the deformed spirit was paralyzed and floated aimlessly. Dee was pulled to the ceiling as two wraiths, resembling stunted children with multiple fanged mouths across their stomachs, began a tug-of-war with his limbs. As Doug and Reggie froze them, Dee dropped as dead weight to the floor. Still more swarmed in with leering, twisted faces, removed of flesh to reveal the horrid musculature beneath and long, disjointed jaws filled with jagged, rotting fangs. Nico fell back in panic, but as she watched her four friends wrestling with the apparitions, a rage grew inside of her. As if by instinct, she withdrew the katana from its sheath across her back, and to her shock it glowed with a lighter shade of the indigo light around her. She was drawing energy from the ghost light and using it to infuse the sword. The ghost saw the weapon and seemed suddenly enamored of the light as she waved it before them in a slow, hypnotic dance. "That's it, you bastards," she said icily as she stalked in a circle around the now still spirits. "Just watch the pretty light." In a blurring flash, she fell into a whirling cyclone as the blade slashed through the ghosts and generated bright flashing cuts of energy over their forms. They cried out in agony as she pierced their immaterial bodies and sent them screaming into the depths of the hospital. The others stood in amazement and watched as the other spirits fell back and hid from the radiance of the sword's glow. "What now?" she asked the others as she stared in awe at her own ability. "I guess we go say hello to our hosts," Dee said, smiling wryly.